Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you all to be here in person as well as online for a very, very important ballot amendment overview as part of Constitution Day 2024. So before we begin, I'd like to go over a little housekeeping. So if you'd like to use the restrooms, we have the restrooms located behind you and across the lobby. And if it's going to be fire alarm, we need to listen to Cronrath and move around like 200 feet from the building. If you're not registered to vote and you would like to, we have Kelly Harper from FSCJ Student Support Services is present and can assist you. She's over there, yes. And after the presentation, please help yourself to refreshments. We have water, sodas, and we have 2 different cookies. So today, Dr. Daniel Cronrath, FSCJ Professor of Political Science, will compare and contrast how state constitutions work and then provide an overview on the amendments and the initiatives that will appear on the November 7th.
Thank you. Today, the topics that I'd like to explore with you today are very simply, quickly, just as a teaching moment, how does the U.S. Constitution vary from the 50 state constitutions that we have in the United States? Often in my experience, when I tell people that they actually have dual citizenship, they get very confused. They're like, I'm not Canadian, I'm not Mexican, what are you? No, we actually have dual. We have a Florida Constitution, we have a U.S. Constitution. Because of our federalist form of government, all of us are protected by both of those entities which have a shared power relationship. So we'll talk about that briefly. The next thing we'll get into, and this is pertinent to us going to the ballots this fall, what are the different ways that state constitutions and the Florida Constitution can be amended? Okay? It may actually surprise you that there are more ways to amend the Florida Constitution than in any state in the United States. Okay? And we have that ability, our legislature has the ability to initiate that, but at the end of the day, anytime that we amend our Constitution, it comes back to the people, all right? Perhaps most importantly to the viewing and listening audience, what's going to be on my ballot when I go in this fall? What will I be looking at? What will the choices I be making? Like, I know I'm probably going to see the name of former President Trump and Vice President Harris, but maybe Senator Scott and his campaign opponent from the Democratic Party. But what's going to be further down the ballot that impacts my life? Well, the answer to that is a lot of things. They may directly impact your life, particularly if you're a student here at FSCJ. And then after that, I invite discussion from everybody in the audience. I welcome it. I frequently, in conversations like this, I learn as much from you as you learn as much from me. I'm a Gen Xer. Being able to engage with the Zoomer generation or Gen Z or whatever you guys refer to yourselves as is always a good refresher for me to see what you guys are looking at and how your lens for America differs from my lens, or say differs from even my parents' lens, who I talk to frequently, because every generation of an American has a very, very different experience when they go to that ballot box in terms of what they're thinking, or when they mail in their ballot, in terms of what they're thinking about when they make these decisions. So, very briefly, how do the U.S. Constitution and state constitutions differ? The first is the idea of permanence. Okay, we adopted our Constitution in 1787 here in the United States to replace the failed Articles of Confederation. Since that time, we have seen fit to amend our Constitution 27 times, okay? 10 initially with the passage of the Bill of Rights. So if you consider the long, 200 plus years of American history, this document has actually, very little has changed. Okay. Now, for some people, these changes have been dramatic, considering that we adopted the Constitution. We actually enshrined the institution of slavery in our Constitution and then had to remove that prior to the end of the Civil War. And of course, we altered it with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. But in reality, the document has not changed that much. Consider the fact that since Florida became a state, we are on our 6th Constitution in Florida. The last one being in 1968 that we actually changed our Constitution, okay? Just a little facts, using a cheat sheet here. One of the other ways in which constitutions change is in their length. Our U.S. Constitution is very, very short relative to the state constitutions. In fact, most state constitutions are 12 times longer than the U.S. Constitution, okay? But no state, just as a fun little exercise, no state has a longer state constitution, not even close, than the state of Alabama. 51 times the size of the U.S. Constitution. Okay, Alabama's Constitution, and get you ready for this, has been amended 950 times in the state of Alabama's histories. And by the way, most state constitutions, the average is around 115 times. In terms of specificity, quickly, our Constitution of the United States, it's kind of vague. It's really a document which talks about what government cannot do to us, whereas state constitutions talk about what we cannot do within our state. Okay, the provisions which are set up which limit our exercise of our Bill of Rights protections to create a civil society within Florida. State constitutions vary dramatically when it comes to how elections are conducted. All right, we know, for example, that in the state of Maine, individuals are allowed to vote from prison. We know that in the state of Oregon, individuals no longer go to vote in person. Everything is done by a mail-in card that they can drop off in a box. We know that in the state of Minnesota, they still allow same-day registration of voters. If you've never registered to vote in your life in Minnesota, you can walk up, you can register, you can vote on the same day. We know there are still some states that do not use voter ID cards, that still do not require a picture ID. So all of these election differences, which are contained in these constitutions, really go into detail about how these states are going to be conducting their elections, whereas the federal or U.S. Constitution has very little specificity. They talk about the nature of the Electoral College, and they talk about the election of members of the House of Representatives in the original document. And that was it. That was the only, until we amended the Constitution to actually directly vote for our U.S. senators, that was all relative to elections, okay? And then also state constitutions get into the specifics of state finances. The federal Constitution, outside of references later in the Constitution to coinage used by states, outside of the fact that we know that it is a delegated power of the U.S. government to create and use a currency and that we all use that currency, you know, relative to finances, the document is very, very vague. So quickly, before we talk about how we amend the Constitution in Florida, let's talk about how we amend it nationally. Two ways to do that. The first is that 2/3 of Congress, made up of our House and Senate, propose an amendment. And then very cleanly, that proposed amendment goes to either 3/4 of our state legislatures or 3/4 of a state special convention to ratify the amendment or accept the amendment. The other way is that 2/3 of states' legislatures ask for a meeting on a proposed amendment. They have a special convention. The amendment is proposed. And then there again, it goes to the state legislature for ratification. I will tell you that in terms of any amendment being ratified at the end outside of the state legislature, there's only been one in which they've actually put together a special state convention. And not to challenge anyone in the audience today, that's actually the 21st Amendment where we repealed the prohibition on alcohol. For whatever reason, historically, we couldn't wait for the state legislatures to meet. They don't always meet in a timely manner, so they had state conventions, and they ended the prohibition on alcohol, which was put into effect by the 18th Amendment. I will tell you that in terms of ratifying the U.S. Constitution, it is very, very difficult. Right? This is by design. Our framers gave us the mechanism in order to ratify our Constitution, but they wanted it to be grueling. They wanted it to be a very deliberate decision whenever we were going to amend this document. I will also share, before I move off the U.S. Constitution for you, the words of that he wrote later on in his life. If you've ever studied or you're familiar with our third president, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson actually thought that the Constitution should be torn up every 19 years and we should start over. Why did Jefferson say this? Because he said he didn't think it was fair for one generation to have to live under the rules that were written by the other. All right. Obviously, we went a completely different way, and our U.S. Constitution still endures today. So there's ways that our constitutions at the state level can be amended both formally and informally. All right. Amending states' constitutions through former changes, which is what we're going to spend most of our time on today. Legislative proposals. States have the ability to call for constitutional conventions, which Florida has this option. States have the ability to have a Constitution Revision Commission, which Florida uses that option, and we'll discuss that briefly. And then what we're really focusing on today is states that use ballot initiatives and ballot referendums. And in Florida, we use ballot initiatives to amend our Constitution. So, just quickly, what is the difference between an initiative and a referendum? Citizens can propose initiatives and vote on constitutional amendments directly. The legislature can also do proposals, which have the form of a ballot initiative, all right? But citizen-oriented initiatives are actually referred to as initiatives, and then the other ones are referred to as amendments proposed by the legislature. We have both of them on the ballot this fall that we're going to be discussing later in the presentation. The other way that we do not do in Florida is a ballot referendum, okay? This is where states allow for citizens to get a pre-number qualified of signatures to override something that the legislature has done. Some states use both mechanisms. They have a ballot initiative. They also have a ballot referendum. Other states, like my home state of Pennsylvania, offer neither, okay? But when we're looking at the ballot initiative that we have here in Florida, what we need to remember is this is a form of not representative democracy. This is a form of direct democracy. We do not see ballot amendments at the federal level in the United States. It is a privilege that we have here in Florida that we Floridians can rise up if we feel that there's a situation which calls us to mobilize, and we have the ability to amend our own Constitution here, which, by the way, I'll just tell you this now, in order to get an amendment this year, based upon the numbers, and I'll get into that, it was slightly under the 900,000 signatures were required from around Florida to see these initiatives, 891. And that number is based upon the number of people who voted in the last presidential election. And I'll show you what that mechanism looks like here in a second, okay? So, our 5 ways, briefly, that we can amend the Constitution here in Florida. First is by constitutional convention. The last one we had in 1968. I said before, I mentioned the CRC, which is the acronym for the Constitution Revision Commission, which just met in 2018. All right. There's the TBRC, or the Taxation and Budget Reform Commission, which is going to be meeting again in 2027. Amendments proposed by the legislature, which we've talked about, and then the Citizens Initiative, or the ballot initiative that we just discussed on the previous slide. So the Constitutional Convention is something we no longer really practice here in Florida. It's been decades. This is signatures from registered voters up to 15% of the total statewide ballots cast in the previous presidential election. That is a very, very high threshold. That would be over 1.6 million people if we were to try to do something like that today. If approved by a simple majority, each state legislative district elects 1 member to the Constitutional Convention, the next succeeding general election. The convention then convenes 21 days later after that. Why don't we use this? To be quite frank with all of you, it's clunky. Okay, we have easier means today to actually amend our Florida Constitution than trying to use these procedures to move forward. One of the easier ones is the CRC, the Constitution Revision Commission. Now, I always try to approach everything. I really do my best in this, even though I have my own ideological opinions to approach everything, through I refer to as principled nonpartisanship. I try to approach everything with a very, very clean lens. You can't do that, however, when you're talking about the CRC, when the Republicans have controlled our legislature for 25 years in Florida, and the appointments to the CRC come from the Attorney General, who's an elected Republican, the Governor, who's an elected Republican, the Speaker of the House, who's an elected Republican, and the President of the Senate is an elected Republican, and the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, who's an appointed Republican and then an elected Republican. So, do they include Democrats on this 37-member commission? Yes. They do try to exercise token bipartisanship, but it's not to the degree that you're going to see real liberal or leftist proposals have any opportunity to make its way out of this commission. Okay? And by the way, as I already say, if you are somebody who's a Democrat or you're a liberal, elections have consequences. Mobilize and change that makeup of the legislature if you wish. Easier said than done, though. I'm sure Florida Democrats can identify with this. So, the last amendments were, to be kind, were controversial that came out of the CRC. I'm not going to review all of these, but what they ended up doing with the ballot is they ended up doing a process in which they called bundling. And they would put 2 different proposals in one amendment, 2 entirely different concepts, and make the Florida electorate choose both, not one or either. Probably my favorite one for all of you in this room was Amendment 9, which asked you if you wanted to prohibit offshore oil and gas drilling while also prohibiting indoor vaping. Now, friends, I invite you to ask yourselves the question, what do these 2 items have in common? I can tell you the Florida CRC, their answer was, well, this is what we call the Clean Water, Clean Air Bill. Friends, you can determine the rationality of that kind of statement or not, but that was the work of the CRC. And you know, in some ways, I think good government fans, like groups like Common Cause and other nonpartisan groups, were a little disappointed because they were hoping that if these initiatives were that important, why weren't they simply selected out on the ballot and given us an up or down choice on both? Why were they bundled together? And that's where people begin to start to discuss the politics, because they feel like there would be opportunities to get something through potentially that wouldn't normally pass, but there was another really attractive element to it that you could use to get through. Okay, that's just the politics of it. The TBRC, again, in 2027. Oh, the other thing I'd like to point out, you guys will be in this room. Hopefully I'm in this room. I'll just be at a much greater geriatric age. The CRC does travel the state every 20 years and collect citizen input. You have the ability to go to these meetings and you have the ability to tell them how you would like to see the amendment done. It's an open public forum. Participation is encouraged. It's welcomed. It's stressed. Okay? Doesn't mean that they're going to do it, but it's going to mean that they're going to hear your voice. So just bear that in mind in the future. Leads us to the TBRC, which is the Taxation Budget and Reform Commission. Again, you can see the composition of the members. Here again, they're going to be appointed by largely Republican figures. And the whole idea of the TRBC is to review the state's budget process, where the state's getting revenue, how it's spending its money, how it's accessing its tax structure. For example, would the TBRC say, we think that Florida has become too dependent on state sales tax. Perhaps we should introduce a state income tax as well, okay, as an offset. I would say that they're never going to do that. However, that would be the nature of the conversation, right? Or we think that Floridians are being crippled by high property taxes. What would be a way that we could offset that revenue through a different form of taxation? Okay, so that's the nature of the TBRC. You would also be able to attend those meetings as well. But please understand, this is not a panacea commission, or you wouldn't just be able to go in and say, yes, I am here because I would like to see in our Constitution LGBTQ rights enshrined in our Constitution. Not that that's a bad issue per se, if that's what you believe in, but it's out of the focus and the function of what the TBRC would be doing. Amendments proposed by the legislature. 60% or more of our legislators in both agreements need to agree on a joint resolution. We're going to see that the majority of our amendments on the fall were actually proposed by the legislature. And also, too, something else I wanted to let you guys know. It used to be that it was only 50%. But in 2006, we created it in Florida. We made it what was a supermajority. 60% of the electorate had to approve that figure. So when you're thinking about something failing between the margins of, say, 51 to 49 or 59 to 41, that 10% becomes something very statistically significant when you're looking at the divide in between the actual popularity of the amendment. Okay, you could have something that fails perhaps this fall, 59 to 41, but a large majority of Floridians were still in favor of something that couldn't quite make it to the supermajority threshold. And then lastly, a citizen initiative, which is us. All right, we form a political committee. We file the paperwork in Tallahassee. They are allowed to raise money on their issue. They are allowed to spend money on their issue, and we'll get into the funders of some of them today. One of the things that you can read from the slide, or if you're listening online, essentially what this is that you don't just have to collect the 891,523 signatures in bulk from a specific location. They have to be geographically dispersed across the state of Florida. Okay, so that there's actual statewide popularity in the initiative demonstrated across our state. Okay, from Pensacola to Key West, there has to be some sort of representation that this is as popular in the rural parts of Florida as it is the metropolitan parts, the panhandle of Florida as it is South Florida. Okay, and then again, for these to pass, as I said, it's a 60% required voting percentage. So now that we've laid out a little bit of the homework, a little bit of the framework to this, let's dive in and let's talk about what we're going to be looking on our ballots this fall. The first one listed is Amendment 1. This was proposed by the legislature. And this was an amendment proposing amendments to the Constitution to require school board elections across the state of Florida to now be partisan. Meaning right now, when we go to vote for our school board members in Duval County, there is no partisan affiliation, no R, no D, no NP, no I, nothing appearing behind the name of that candidate. This amendment would require that to start happening in November of 2026. So what is the motivation of that? Well, one of the proponents, who's a state senator here from Florida, from the 22nd District, he said, parties engage in these races. There's no such thing as a nonpartisan race anymore. This is what his logic is. These races are partisan, and the only ones that aren't informed are being tricked. And what happens is there are games that are going to be played with these races all over the time, and I'm just trying to pull the bag off of voters' heads. And when you look at a lot of the statements of support from a lot of our elected officials, this is a very, very common theme. Everybody already understands partisan politics. Everybody participates in partisan politics. Why don't we give the voter the benefit of the doubt and just let them know what party these people are from? That's the proponent. As I can best support it and frame it, that is the proponent position. Okay. Just to give you a little bit of the numbers, Florida right now only is one of 41 states with nonpartisan races. This is a pretty big number, considering the fact there are 358 school board members in Florida representing 4,200 schools, serving almost 3 million kids, okay, in the Florida K through 12 system. Most progressive organizations in Florida oppose this. They would like to keep the partisanship out of school board races, where most Republicans support this. I will say, and you can draw whatever conclusion you want, Republicans have a voter registration edge in Florida. Okay, so electorally, while we could, whatever their motivations may be, and if you like those motivations, this is something that by their calculation would benefit Republicans at the polls versus Democrats, which frankly is in a lot of cases why many Democrats are opposed to this, all right? One recent poll that was done on this issue right now indicates 33% support, 48% in opposition, and 19% of voters who are going to be undecided. So if you were going to armchair quarterback this one at this stage, this one looks like it would be in trouble, just in terms of it reaching its 60% threshold. And really, you know, a lot of Floridians and a lot of people I talk to, and this is purely anecdotal, a lot of people liking the idea that they want to do their own research for their school board member without necessarily having to look at their party label. But certainly opponents to that would be like, you know what, this legislation will just make it easier for people to figure out who they want to vote for. And those are the two sides of both of this amendment. Okay. Amendment 2 proposed by the legislature is the right to fish and hunt, constitutionally enshrining this. Interesting, wide bipartisan support, both with Republicans and Democrats. This is proposing the amendment to the state constitution to preserve forever fishing and hunting, including, which is, and this is, we'll get into the second a little bit, some of the opposition on this, traditional methods of hunting. Hunting is a public right and a preferred means and a responsibility of controlling our wildlife population here in Florida, okay? Obviously, there's going to be wide support among outdoor recreation groups, hunting groups, other groups that you know are purporting its economic vitality. We'll get to this in a second. The estimates a little bit vary, but people coming into Florida, we may not lose sight of this, but to commercially fish is a multi-billion-dollar industry for our state, for people to come in. And in the minds of the supporters of this resolution, of this constitutional amendment, pardon me, this is us sending a message that Florida's here to stay. We are an outdoor state. We protect your right to hunt and fish. Come on in, get your sports fishing license, get your hunting license, spend your money in the most beautiful state. Okay, that would be the message of that. 23 states have already done this and passed, some going back decades and even centuries, in terms of a constitutional right to do this. A lot of them in our South, or in the South, not exclusively, okay? Not exclusively. There are states in the Northeast that have also done this a long time ago. Opponents, what would be the opposition to this? Well, opponents are objecting to the phrase of, you know, for example, traditional methods. We have already banned or prohibited some of the methods that we traditionally used to hunt with because we consider them to be cruel and unusual in terms of hunting. Steel traps, spear fishing, gill nets, which is a very, very painful way for fish to die if they're being harvested, okay? So that's the first concern of a lot of environmental groups. And then the other, and this is legitimate, the other thing is that in 2002, we already passed a statute in Florida. Now, you could say, well, it's a statute versus an amendment. An amendment to the Constitution is something generated by the people. A statute is something passed by the legislature. So the legislature, theoretically, in the future, could repeal a statute. They could not repeal a constitutional amendment to fish and hunt unless they went back and did another constitutional amendment to fish and hunt. So proponents are saying, listen, we've already got this on the books to a certain degree. Why change it, okay? Now, there's been no polling conducted. The only bit of public opinion I can really find about this in any kind of way to like meaningfully oppose it, because even the Democrats supported it here in our state, was the Orlando Sentinel, who wrote, as you can see, this argument we see now for this stinker, is what they refer to it as, is its bait. It's intended to draw out low information, far-right voters who can be easily swindled into believing that their rights are somehow under attack and that this will somehow have an impact at the ballot for conservative voters that will increase potential benefits for Republican voters. No polling has been conducted. You know, I can't you know, give you any hard data to decide whether that strategy would even be effective or not. You know, we've got a competitive presidential election on top. We know with a lot of people who traditionally fish and hunt that President Trump is a very, very popular candidate. What kind of bump this would actually do in terms of electoral turnout? Oh, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it seems hypothetical at best to me, but this is the Orlando Sentinel's editorial board, who knows as much about this as you and I do, okay? Just doing the best job that they can to hypothesize. So, the big ones, that probably most of us are familiar with and most of us have seen, particularly on the college campuses, the adult use of marijuana, okay? You guys can read the language. What it would basically do is it would legalize marijuana in the state of Florida for personal use. It would keep the medical cards that allowed individuals now who had larger quantities of marijuana, they would still be able to purchase them. Somebody had asked me, you know, what was the actual provision? So outside of what was on the ballot, I got into it. It's 3 ounces of personal use of marijuana, okay, with 5 grams of concentrate. Okay, so that's the measure that you could legally have it. To be clear, this does not make selling marijuana legal. This does not really change any other provision in law. If you get pulled over driving a vehicle under the influence of marijuana, you will be arrested. Okay, this does not change federal law relative to marijuana. And may I also remind you that at the federal level, marijuana is still a Schedule I drug. Okay, so if you were, for example, going to go to apply for a job with government, if you wanted to go work for the federal government, they're still going to drug test you regardless of what Florida's medical marijuana policy is. So please be aware of that. Okay, that none of that would change. All right. So where's opposition coming from? Well, opposition is coming from the Republican Party. And if any of you have turned on your television, you're going to see that a lot of opposition has come to the idea that a lot of the people who are going to be selling marijuana are large, huge corporations, and that people who thought that there was going to be opportunities for mom and pop growers of marijuana are going to be shut out of the process. Okay, a lot of other opposition is far more granular. How much will it cost me now to go in and purchase recreational marijuana, even though I may have been doing it before? What's the cost going to be now? Okay. You can see the quote from Governor DeSantis, who is very, very opposed to both this and Amendment 4. He is very concerned that our towns in Florida are going to start smelling like marijuana. There's neighborhoods in Jacksonville. I don't know if the governor's been to lately, but there are already places that is occurring. And nearly all progressive organizations here in Florida are supportive of this measure. So you can see the partisan divide. You can see the ideological divide. Another interesting thing that we're going to get into the next one is because marijuana is going to be sold, what is the financial input? So we have something called the Financial Impact Estimating Conference, which is called in the Florida State Senate to try to put a price tag on how changing or amending the Constitution would do that if there was actually something involved in that process. So this is by most people considering this to be a conservative estimate, that when this market is fully explored, that you're going to be under slightly $200 million annually collected in revenue from medical marijuana sales in Florida. Could be much higher. I'm just giving you the data that they put out from the state. Okay, this is from other states' experiments and the other states which have legalized marijuana. You're looking at who's fighting it. Let's look at the money on both sides. True Leave, which is a very, very large marijuana grower, very, very commercial, they've spent themselves over $82 million on a $90 million effort supporting this campaign. By now, if you watch any kind of legacy television or even YouTube or something, you've probably all seen an ad one way or the other. Opposition is from Keep Florida Clean, and then Governor DeSantis' very own created Florida Freedom Fund. Okay, he's very, very much opposed to this, and he's raised nearly $15 million to push back on it. Where are the polls? Now, some of us can value polls. We know polls fail us. The average of the last 5 polls right now shows support at 60.8%, 30.8% in opposition, with an undecided figure that typically when you get that number of undecideds, when it's that low on election day, split it in half and you're probably going to see it fall to both sides, okay, when they go in. What can impact these polls? We know you have to have a 60% threshold. If you are a young person sitting in this room right now and you are somebody who would like to see medical marijuana approved, and this is something that you support, understand that your generation, 18 to 30-year-olds, are notorious for not showing up on election day. Okay, the people who do show up based on the demographics are people who are older, who've come from a generation where they do not use marijuana and do not have the favorable opinion that many do of marijuana. So when you're looking at that, if you feel confident in that 60.8%, don't. Okay? If you're somebody who opposes that, understand that if you're part of that 30.8%, you got to show up. Okay? Because there's going to be people who are showing up who believe, they're going to be twice the number. But there have been lots of times that legislative proposals have been defeated because there's more passion and more spirit on one side of the issue, even if it's minority, than the other. Okay? And by the way, just as a refresher for you guys who are on the younger side, medical marijuana was approved at 71% to 29% in 2016. So Florida is trending this direction, okay? And that's where we're at on Amendment 3. The other, the big one that we're going to have the ballot that there's talking about is the Right to Abortion Initiative, okay? Hotly contested issue nationally, hotly contested issue here in the state of Florida. An organization named the Floridians Protecting Freedom is leading the initiative. By the way, people have asked me in the past, where do they get these names? I've got a very easy answer for you. They make them up. They just make them up. That's what they wanted to call their group, and that's what they named their group. You guys can see no law shall penalize, delay, restrict abortion before viability when necessary to protect the patient's life, as determined by the patient's health care provider. The amendment does not change the legislature's constitutional authority to require notification to a parent and guardian before a minor or to have an abortion. Okay, that's how the language is written. Opposition is coming from logical places. The Florida Republican Party, who's always been very, very consistently pro-life. A lot of Christian organizations, including the Florida Conference of Catholic Bishops. Other people, and I say this, individuals such as Ben Shapiro, a lot of right-wing commentators who a lot of conservative students enjoy listening to his podcast. Support from the Democratic Party of Florida, almost unanimous across the board, the ACLU. And you can get an idea there of the other various organizations which are involved with the opposition. And if you have questions, of course, at the end, we can open that up for discussion if you have any further comments on that. Very, very much, I guess is what I'm trying to indicate, split along a partisan divide, okay? Very controversial. Legislation was filed over this. This was fought out in courts, okay? The State Attorney General, Ashley Moody, fought very hard to make sure that there was a financial impact statement included with the abortion language. People were saying, why, we understand like the revenue going to be raised from marijuana, we understand like this. What does this have to do with actually having the right to choose? What does this actually have the right to do with if you're somebody who opposes this, if you believe that life begins at conception or wherever you believe it began? What does this have to issue? The reality of it is they got it through, they won their court battle, and you guys can read the language. In your own mind, we can bring this up later for discussion. It's totally up to you. But for now, we'll just advance through it, and we'll say that the proposed amendment would result in significantly more abortions and fewer live births. Okay, increase in abortions could be even greater if the amendment invalidates laws regarding parental consent. I just kind of read the amendment for you, but I'll continue. If minors undergo abortion and those ensuring only licensed physicians become abortions. There's also uncertainty about whether the amendment will require the state to subsidize abortions. Again, I read the language of the amendment, not just what's on the ballot, everything. I personally saw no reference to that, but this is a concern of folks who are in opposition to it. Litigation to those to resolve the uncertainties, basically saying, how much will it cost Florida when we get sued? Okay. There's been many things Florida has been sued over that they have not looked at the financial impact statement of that language, but in this particular case they did. And an increase in abortions may negatively affect the growth of state and local revenues over time. Now, opponents of this, first of all, were angered by this, but this is probably the last statement that they actually listed in the financial impact statement. After putting all of this on the ballot, they said, because the fiscal impact of increased abortions on state and local revenues cannot be estimated, the total impact of the proposed amendment is indeterminate. Leading those who support the legislation to ask, then why did you weigh in at the very beginning and even put this statement on there if it's an indeterminate figure, if you don't have anything that you can report out from it? Or is this just a way, and I'm speaking not necessarily my personal view, but the proponents of the bill, or was this just a way to confuse Florida voters on the language when they actually went in to cast their vote? Okay, that's what's at stake with the politics statewide. You have $51 million raised now from Protecting Florida's Freedom, combined opposition funding for $5 million. Interesting, as contentious as this issue is, they've raised twice as much money over legalized marijuana as they have over abortion in terms of their advertising. The average of the last 5 polls, even closer than the last issue. 59.8% in support, 26% in opposition, 14.2% undecided. So what does this leave you with? It leaves you that if you really believe in this amendment, you need to get out to vote. And also with a 60% threshold, if you are very pro-life and you would completely oppose this message, then you need to get those individuals who feel the same way as you out, and you need to organize them to vote. Okay? On both of these issues, recreational marijuana and on abortion, these are very, very real issues which are going to be impacting us in the fall. And just a little bit of medical information. I got this from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists because I didn't want to talk about. One of the other complaints was defining what viability is, because that was another big content. When is a fetus viable? And they generally say that it's not considered viable until after 24 weeks of gestation. Okay, that's their definition, in terms of viability, all right, science-wise. Number 5. Less in the news, but if you're a homeowner, maybe just as important. I will tell you if you are somebody involved with local government, very important. Proposed by the legislature with strong Republican support and Democratic opposition. What this amendment would essentially do, knowing that it's partisan, that's no shock to anybody, is homeowners in Florida enjoy a homestead exemption, okay, which can go up to as much as $75,000 a year. And they basically, if you've ever filed income taxes, just think about this as your standardized deduction. Okay, it's what the value of your home is, but we're backing out a certain amount before we tax it. What this amendment would do is it would adjust this figure automatically for inflation. Okay, so the exemption on the property value of your home would go up as inflation went up. Okay, in effect, it would give you a tax break in bad economic times. So you're saying, well, this would sound good. Who would possibly oppose this? Well, the answer is local governments who depend upon that source of revenue in order to provide you with basic services. Now, the first thing I will tell you is that this does not include educational funding. Okay, so you're not getting an additional break and you're not getting an inflation adjustment for school taxes. Only your other local government taxes, which many local officials, Republican and Democrat, would argue are just as important. Sheriff's offices, fire departments, okay? The reality is no poll is conducted, but in my experience, I see no way this is not going to pass. If you give a Floridian the opportunity to lower their tax burden, they are going to lower their tax burden, okay? You can make the logical argument all day long about the reduction in services, but I think all of us here in this room, if you've owned a home, you're like, oh wait, I get to pay less taxes? Okay, all right. And I think you're gonna see that across the board. Our last one today, the repeal of public financing statewide. We have 4 offices here in Florida in which you can actually get public financing support to run. Okay, our governor, our chief financial officer, our attorney general, and then our secretary of agriculture. This is strange. In many states, we don't elect these offices. These people are appointed by the governor. But in this state, we elect all of these positions, and they are eligible to get public financing. Okay, you can see that back in 1998, we approved this 64%. And just to give you a little bit of the historical framework here, the reference, is the idea is that if you had somebody who was middle class or upper middle class who was not uber wealthy, but they wanted to run for this office, that there would be a way that they could be encouraged to run to say that if they were able to raise $10 million on their own, the taxpayer would match them $10 million, okay? As a way that they could combat the giant who was going to be raising $500 million or $600 million, okay? So there have been attempts in the past to defund this. As you guys can see, I just got done telling you who it was. In the 2022, the expenditure limit for gubernatorial candidates was $30 million. Okay, that was $2 per registered voter, and then you could see the candidates limited at 15.4. Whether or not this will pass, the legislature tried to do this in 2010, 52.49% of the vote. There's been no public polling. I will tell you guys very candidly, I don't have a firm feel on whether or not this will pass or not. Historically, Floridians have said that they enjoy the idea of public financing, but we'll just have to see. I mean, will that hold true? I mean, I've had a lot of people say, you know, elections have gotten so expensive now as it is. Why are we helping subsidize $100 million campaigns for these public offices with taxpayer money? I think that purists would also say, well, the availability of that money could still allow a third party or an independent or a no party affiliation voter, if they were popular, to run, and at least give them a puncher's chance. Okay, that would be the opposition to it as I understand it. So with that, at minute almost 40, I will open this up to questions, discussions, comments, anything you guys want to know. I can go back in the slides as well, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Do you have any questions, guys?
Curious about Amendment 4 and why it's titled the Abortion Act instead of Women's Reproductive Rights. So are we not including in vitro fertilization, birth control, any of those other factors, or is it just straight abortion?
So when I read it, that's what it looks like. Okay, there was back when this was first attempted nationally, and this is something that I don't bring this up as a poke the bear, but I bring this up just more as a reality. In 2008, one of the big issues was a federal abortion act, and they referred to it as the Freedom of Choice Act. And at the time, if you recall, with the popularity of President Obama, he won a sweeping election. He had a filibuster to get a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. And when he was asked if he was going to pursue the legislation, he said, no, not at this time. I think it's going to be too divisive. So he really, at the time, campaigned on this issue. And it's kind of sad in a way if you're really a champion of this, because we could have settled this 15 years ago with national legislation, which would have made the court's decision in the Dobbs case irrelevant, because we would have had federal precedent. To your point, I think it's very, very limited just on that. It's a different, but and a lot of, honestly, the lot of discussion here that they're using is the definition of viability. Some of the ads are suggesting, all of these other amendments are very, very specific in language, but yet viability is undetermined. Which is why I wanted to stress in my points from the other view is that viability is determined by a woman and her doctor, her physician. That would be what the intent was of that constitutional amendment.
Do you have any other questions?
How long do you think the rule changes for specific amendments would differ? Like, let's say if the abortion happens effectively or marijuana, how long would like the effect goes to each person being elected?
Oh, you mean like the implementation?
Yeah.
6 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, hearing none, let's.
Let me just as a closure too, like in terms of my research, I just have to like, open up the box and show you guys the tricks. There are websites out there. The one I would definitely encourage you to go to is Ballotpedia. Really, really well-sourced site that you don't have to wonder if the sources are legitimate because there's hyperlinks to all of those sources. So if you, outside of just what's going to be appearing on your ballot, if you want to get more detailed information like regarding what your question was, or if you really want to be able to read the language yourself, like for example, it doesn't say on on Amendment 3 for possession of medical marijuana, it doesn't list what the quantity is. We don't know that as voters, and that may be something very, very important. 3 ounces of personal use is very, very different than walking around with 5 kilos, But it does, when you want to do this research, you can easily get in there and you can find that information to research it for yourself.
I just have a question. Ballotpedia, would that also give us information on the judges?
It does.
Okay, great.
Yeah, it's a very, very comprehensive website, but I would also encourage you to, at least in my experience, trust only those statements that you can actually click on the hyperlink and then track it back. Because it's just as, as any website, it's only as good as the content, as the people inputting the content, so.
Cronrath, I don't have a question for Vlad. Can you repeat what Don's question was, just so the audience can hear?
Oh.
Would Ballotpedia give us information about the judges?
Yeah, Ballotpedia is a very, very comprehensive website. Ballotpedia is also useful too because it begins your search in terms of those hyperlinks. One of the things I've always liked to say about elected officials or about policies, if you really want to understand it, find the money. Okay, so when you get on there and you look at the groups who are actually supplying this and you research these groups, typically you're going to find out what the motivation is for these groups to be supporting this initiative, and you're going to be able to track that back. Also, a lot of these organizations have to disclose their donors. So it's also very, very revealing also to look at who's actually out there with the money that's backing these proposals, just to help inform you and to be more candid about what's taking place. I mean, for example, the one complaint, regardless of how you feel about medical marijuana, the one observation that this is a big corporate endeavor with tens of $millions being spent on this because there's going to be specific out-of-state corporations to get wealthy, that's true. There's very little left in that language for mom and pop, or even for like a lot of cannabis advocates who are like, can I grow my own certain amount? The legislation does not, nothing under Florida law is going to change that. Okay, it's still going to be illegal for individuals who wish to grow their own.
Without another ballot initiative. Right?
Without another, or Florida statute could do it as well.
I have a question about the Marijuana Act, the recreational use. Would that offer any breaks to people that were previously, they got into legal trouble for possession? Or?
I don't know.
Okay.
Good question.
Has anybody got any questions?
Yeah. I wanted to comment, really kind of wrapping my head about the Board of Education and the candidacy or partisan identifiers. As a parent, I can kind of understand the point behind that, but really on a broader scope, what's this? Because like there's a lot of communication or a lot of social media influencers out there referring to really what's being brought into schools and trying to help put that back into the parents and their decision on what they want their children to be exposed to. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like that's probably more where that's going? Or?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that here specifically, I think that this issue has become partisan. I think a lot of the parents who identify with conservative, being a conservative, we know what the nature is of our schools right now with parents who find certain material to be inappropriate. They want their children to have access to that material. They don't believe that a school is the place for them to be learning about certain things or being exposed to that. They want to protect their child based on their own values. And I think that you're going to find the majority of those parents are going to be comfortable with seeing an R behind the name of that candidate, so that if they don't want to do the research, they can go in there and say, I know because they're a Republican that they're consistent with the way I feel. Also, by the way, that would apply on the other side as well. You know, if you are somebody, you know, you're raising a queer kid, you know, you want them to have access to information about their own bodies, whatever the case may be, you're going to vote for that school board candidate who also represents your values. And 95 out of 100 times, that's going to be the Democrat in that scenario. I hope that answers your question. I think that's part of the motivation. Yeah.
Okay, any more questions? Well, hearing none, let's thank Dr.
Thank you.
Cronrath for an excellent presentation.